In this guide, I'll be teaching you everything you need to know about Shadow Priest in Season 4. We'll go over talents, rotation, stat priority, gear, consumables, enchants, and any macros that I use. Starting with the talents, I'll first go over some of the most notable pickups from the class tree. We'll pick up Protective Light as one of our defensives, causing our flash heal to reduce our damage taken by 10% for 10 seconds. This is great as an on-demand damage reduction. Here we'll also pick up some mobility with Angelic Feather, and then build down towards some of our most powerful utility as a priest in Power Infusion and Mass Dispel. With Twins of the Sun Priestess under Power Infusion, we can now cast it on an ally at the same time at 100% effectiveness, which pairs up super nicely with some specs. To add to the utility here, we'll pick up Vampiric Embrace as a really powerful tool for off healing, especially when paired with offensive cooldowns. Below here we can choose between Divine Star or Halo. Generally this is a preference pick as both of them are mainly used as insanity generators. I personally prefer Divine Star as its instant cast, but either are a great pickup. This also allows us to build into one of our bigger defensives in Angelic Bulwark, causing us to gain a big absorb shield when an attack brings us below 30% health. On the right side of the tree we can find our more offensive talents. Death and Madness gives us a nice boost to our execute, allowing us to use Shadow Word Death once more if we fail to kill the target, as well as generating us more insanity. And then down the bottom right we'll pick up Mind Games as a small cooldown. You can choose to flesh this cooldown out a bit more with the talents underneath it for a minimal DPS gain, but instead you could swap these points out for even more utility by taking Purify Disease, which is essential for dungeons like Brackenhide Hollow, or even Phantasm to break free from snares and the entangling affix. Moving on to the Shadow specific talents then, we'll start with the Mythic Plus build. Psychic Link is our most notable pickup here as this is how Shadow Priests do their AoE damage. Any targets with Vampiric Touch active on them will also suffer 30% of the damage you deal from direct spells. To make spreading our dots easier, we'll be taking Shadow Crash, which will apply up to 8 Vampiric Touches to enemies it hits. And with the talent Misery, our Vampiric Touch now also applies Shadow Word Pain, making it super easy to get our dots rolling on multiple enemies. In the middle, we'll be picking up Void Eruption as our main cooldown. This enters us into a Void form where we gain access to Void Bolt, which contributes heavily to our tier set through spawning more shadowy apparitions. A huge damage source for us in Mythic Plus. To even further bolster this damage, we'll also pick up Auspicious Spirit. We'll now talk about some of the flex points. By default here I've selected Mental Decay as you gain around 2% damage, but in higher keys where you'll need survivability, you'll want to remove this point and pick up Mental Fortitude. This gives you a nice passive shield to make you slightly tankier. Another point up for debate is between Mind's Eye and Distorted Reality. With Distorted Reality, you'd be spreading out your Devouring Plagues instead of dumping them into one target. This will give you an edge on overall damage for sure, but you do lose a hefty amount of priority damage by not taking Mind's Eye. Finally, you can also choose where to put the points placed in Maddening Touch. I do prefer Maddening Touch as it syncs well with Mind's Eye and does nice damage, but you can swap this out for Mind Devourer to buff up your Devouring Plague damage. Moving on to the single target build, we'll still path down the right side of the tree to pick up Void Torrent for big on-demand burst, as well as gaining access to Idol of Cthulhu, but instead of taking Shadow Crash, we'll stick these extra points in Dark Evangelism. If you do have frequent ads spawning throughout a raid fight, then you can move these points back into Shadow Crash. As far as stats go for the Shadow Priest, Intellect is going to be your most important stat, so item level is generally your best bet. For secondaries, Haste is your most important stat as all spells scale really well with this stat, followed by Mastery and Critical Strike. Versatility isn't a bad stat, but it's definitely not desired, though it is nice for some passive tankiness. Crafting depends on where your focus lies as a Shadow Priest. Generally, for maximum output, I'd recommend to craft 2 off pieces with a blue silken lining embellishment, regardless of the content you're clearing. However, if you do want to maximize raid performance for progression, then you can start by crafting the allied wrist guards of Time Dilation, as this provides the most value to your group. For trinkets, your best in slots will be Whispering Incarnate icon and the Neltharian's Call to Suffering. This combo gives you some nice passive stats while also generating some bigger bursts when you proc your Nelth trinket. In terms of other trinkets, due to the nature of the season, there are many options, so I'd recommend simming your best. But Tome of Unstable Power is an amazing pickup for AoE encounters, as well as the Ominous Chromatic Essence as a great general stat stick. Here is a list of the best gear to spend your Bullions on. Vakash the Shadowed Inferno is your biggest upgrade due to its rarity and strength, so you'll want to spend your first Bullions on grabbing this mace. After purchasing this, I'd opt for the Seal of Dirna's Chosen, as the mace and also the head enchant will proc the extra fire damage. Next we can grab some trinkets. Whispering Incarnate Icon or Ominous Chromatic Essence are great all-round choices dependent on your group, and for your other trinket you'll want to grab Neltharian's Call to Suffering. After this you'll go for the Voice of the Silent Star, followed by the other Vault of the Incarnate's Ring, but basically with your Bullions you'll be targeting all the rare drops from the raids because of their rarity but also their power. For enchants, you'll want to use the Wafting Devotion on your weapon. You'll enchant your head with the Incandescent Essence. You'll enchant with Avoidance on your cloak and braces to help you become a tad more tanky. Waking stats will be your chest enchant. On your belt, you'll rock with a Shadow Belt clasp. You'll use a Frozen Spell Thread for your legs. On your boots, you'll apply a Watcher's Loam. And for your rings, I recommend you to sim what your best stat enchants will be, but generally haste is a good recommendation. For consumables, you run an Ice Vial of Corrupting Rage, though Tepid Versatility can be a safer pickup. Elemental Potion of Ultimate Power will be your DPS potion of choice, with a Dreamwalker's Healing Potion being your go-to healing potion. On your weapon, you'll want to use a Howling Rune for some extra haste, and if you can afford it, the Dreambound Augment Rune will be used in all situations. For your food buff, you'll want to consume a feast ideally, but deviously deviled eggs are a good backup with some personal food. And lastly, for your gems, you'll want to run with a Fierce Illimited Diamond as your Primalist gem, and then you can fill the remaining slots with Keen Emeralds, but you may want to run a sim for your own character. Finally, getting into the rotation, some general tips for your Shadow Priest rotation is to keep your dots active on as many targets as possible at all times. And adding to this, provided you're talented into Mind's Eye, you'll want to keep all 3 of your dots active on your main target. These being Vampiric Touch, Shadow Web Pain, and Devouring Plague. The final tip is to keep from overcapping on resources like Mind Blast charges and Void Bolt while in Void Eruption, as well as Insanity by dumping on Devouring Plague. Now getting into the opener, we'll start with single target. You'll start by pre-casting Vampiric Touch, then we cast Shadow Fiend, into 2 Mind Blasts, then we pop Void Eruption along with Trinkets and Potions. At the same time, we cast Power Infusion on an ally, straight into a Void Bolt, then we dump Insanity with Devouring Plague, then we Mind Blast, and finally we use Void Torrent. Following this opener, you'll proceed with the following priority list. You'll want to maintain Vampiric Touch and Shadow Web Pain, then we're going to cast Shadow Fiend. Here we'll use Void Eruption, but make sure to spend the Mind Blast charges before. At the same time, we'll use Power Infusion. Our next priority is to cast Void Bolt. Then we'll use Devouring Plague if it's not already active, or if Mind Devourer is procced. Then we cast Mind Blast to prevent from overcapping. After this, we'll use Void Torrent, then we'll channel Mind Flay Insanity. After this, we can cast Shadow Word Death if the target is below 20% HP. Here we'll cast Mind Games. Then we're going to deplete our Insanity with Devouring Plague. Then we're going to fill with a normal Mind Flay. And finally, if you need to move, use instant spells like Divine Star and Shadow Word Pain or Shadow Word Death. For AoE, your rotation and opener will barely change. All you need to do is pre-apply Vampiric Touch with Fade as the tank gathers if there's more than 8 mobs. Then we're going to use Shadow Crash on the remaining 8 mobs to dot them up, and then we proceed with the exact same opener and priority list. We'll now move on to some advanced tips for the Shadow Priest for people looking to min-max their DPS. If you're doing a big pull in Mythic Plus, for example, make sure to start dotting up the mobs as the tank gathers them. Using Fade will eliminate all the threat you generate. This means that once everything is gathered, you can then Shadow Crash the last 8 mobs, enter your cooldowns and maintain all dots with your Void Bolts so long as the mobs are grouped. The next tip is to send your Mindbender or Shadow Fiend on cooldown. The DPS gain from them is not big enough to warrant saving for cooldowns, so instead just maximize your usage throughout the dungeon or encounter. Finally, Shadow doesn't have a great deal of mobility, so you need to make sure you're using your instant cast spells to pre-position well. Lastly, here's the macros I use as a Shadow Priest. I'll leave a paste bin in the description for you guys to copy. For my main cooldown macro, it will use Dark Ascension or Void Eruption depending on what I'm talented into, and macroed into this I always have Power Infusion. This isn't always recommended, but you're generally always going to be using your Power Infusion during your cooldowns, so it makes life easier. Attached to the Power Infusion is a mouse over macro, so make sure you're hovering over the PI recipient when you press the cooldown. To add to this, again something that I wouldn't normally recommend but it's good for new players, is to also add Vampiric Embrace to this macro. In more coordinated groups you might want to save your Vampiric Embrace for certain parts of the encounter, but generally you're going to get the most healing throughput from using it with your offensive cooldowns. I also use a macro for my Shadow Crash. This may not be ideal for new Shadow Priests that need to get used to the radius of Shadow Crash, but once you're more experienced, this removes the extra button click before you fire out your Shadow Crash. I use a mouse over macro tied to abilities like Purified Disease and also Leap of Faith to easily interact with my teammates without swapping targets. And finally, I use an app player macro for my Angelic Feather. This makes Feather always spawn on my character so that I can make sure I'm getting the speed buff, but with this I'd recommend having a separate normal keybind in case you need to give them to your team. But that's all you need to know for the Shadow Priest, so hopefully you guys were able to learn a few things. If you did, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy, and until next time, I'll catch you guys later.